Welcome back. In this video we're going to start with an introduction to SQL Server Management Studio. Hopefully you've already successfully installed SQL Server. If you haven't, you can always read the installation guide on how to do so. If you encounter any issues during the installation, feel free to let me know using the comment section so I can assist you. If you start SQL Server Management Studio, this should be the first form you see, where it prompts you to connect to a server. First we have the server type, which we're going to leave to its default. Then we have the server name or the name of this SQL Server instance. By default this name is equal to the name of the computer. On a single computer we can run multiple instances of SQL Server, which are essentially multiple copies of the SQL Server executable program running in the background. This is where we come across the concept of named instances. A named instance is an instance of SQL Server that has the computer name, and a separate name for the instance which is specified during the installation. In this demo, I have left it to the default, which is my computer name. Then we have authentication. SQL Server supports two authentication modes, Windows authentication, and a mixed mode authentication, which is a combination of Windows and SQL Server authentication. Windows authentication is often referred to as an integrated security, because it's integrated into Windows. Since we're already logged into Windows, we don't have to supply credentials to separately log into SQL Server. It's already been taken care of. Then we have the mixed mode authentication. The idea here is that we can log in using either Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. SQL Server authentication requires us to authenticate ourselves by specifying the name of the login and a password. So, we're now going to connect using the Windows authentication mode. Then I'm going to configure the SQL Server instance and change the authentication mode to mixed mode authentication, so we can also try out SQL Server authentication. So let's connect. We are now connected to the SQL Server instance. At the left we have the Object Explorer. At the top of the tree list you have the name and version of the SQL Server instance. We also have the name of the login, in this case the name of the domain user we have used to connect to this SQL Server instance. Then we have the classifications of things that are on this server. For now we're briefly going to focus on databases and security. If we expand the databases node, you'll see all the databases that are on the server. Here we have system databases, which are created by SQL Server itself. We haven't created any databases yet, but if we had, they would also appear in this section. If we right-click on the SQL Server instance, and on Properties, you'll see some very important information about the server, as well as a number of options we can use to configure this SQL Server instance. If we head over to the Security tab, you'll see the authentication modes I was telling you about earlier in the video. By default we have Windows authentication mode selected. Let's change this to mixed mode authentication. As a general rule, we need to restart the SQL Server instance after configuring the server. But we're not going to do that just yet. In order to authenticate ourselves, we need to create a login. A login is an identity used to connect to a SQL Server instance. If not changed during the installation, a login based on the Windows domain group will be created for us. This is the reason why we were able to log in using Windows authentication. So, if we now want to authenticate ourselves using SQL Server authentication, we would need to create a SQL Server login. If we expand the Security node, and the Logins node as well, you'll see a number of logins here. What's important to us right now are the logins that start with the SQL Server instance name. Which for me is this one. If we right-click, and select Properties, you'll see the properties of this login. First thing we see is that this login is based on Windows authentication. This is the login we used when we first connected to this instance. As you can see the password fields are both disabled. That's because this is integrated into Windows. The same credentials we used when we log into Windows are the same credentials this login uses. If we head over to User Mapping, you'll see a column named User. This is where things get a little bit interesting. In SQL Server we have logins and users. A user uses a login to authenticate at the SQL Server instance. Basically we create a login and map it to a number of users, so that they can log in. In the videos where we'll cover database administration fundamentals, we'll take a deeper dive into SQL Server security. For now, let's just click Cancel and create a new login. Right-click on Logins, and select New Login. The new login we create will be for SQL Server authentication, which means that we'll have to specify the credentials. Let's click OK. And restart the SQL Server instance. The instance has now been restarted. We're going to disconnect this SQL Server instance by right-clicking on it, and selecting Disconnect. So we can connect to it again, this time using the SQL Server authentication mode. If we click on Connect, you'll see the following dialog, which prompts us to change the password for this login. This is just a security mechanism SQL Server uses. Let's specify a new password for this login. We are now logged in using SQL Server authentication. I'm going to pause the video, set the authentication mode back to its default, and connect again using the Windows authentication mode. Once you've also done that, we're going to restore a database, so we can finally start with querying databases. To restore a database, we need to have a database backup file. I've attached a database backup file to this lecture. I hope you've already downloaded it. Let's head over to Databases, right-click, and select Restore. We're going to restore a database that is on this device. So, let's open the Browse dialog. Here we can add a backup media, which is basically the backup file you've just downloaded. Here we have a tree list where we can navigate to the directory where the backup media is stored. Then we're going to select the Northwind database backup file. Let's wait for it to load. Now we're going to restore the database. As you can see, the database has been successfully restored. You'll now be able to see the Northwind database in the Object Explorer. I hope you had fun getting somewhat familiar with SQL Server Management Studio. In the next video we're going to start with querying databases. Thank you for watching. See you then.